It was a warm Wednesday afternoon when Captain Angela Pierce stepped out of her unmarked police car. She had just returned from a meeting downtown, her crisp uniform gleaming under the sun. Angela was one of the highest-ranking officers in her precinct, having earned the respect of her peers through years of hard work and dedication. A tall, confident black woman in her late 30s, she commanded every room she entered. Her sharp gaze could assess a situation instantly, and her ability to lead was unparalleled. Today, she was stopping by a local convenience store to grab a quick snack before heading back to the station. The store was a small one, tucked into the corner of an aging strip mall, but it was a favorite spot of hers, a place where she had often chatted with the cashier about the neighborhood. As she entered the store, a slight buzz of unease filled the air, but she shrugged it off. Maybe it was the tension of the day, or maybe she was just tired. Inside, the cashier, an older man named Mr. Patel, greeted her with a smile, recognizing her immediately. "Good to see you again, Captain Pierce," he said, nodding respectfully. "Hey, Mr. Patel, just grabbing something quick," Angela replied with a warm smile. She picked up a bottle of water and a granola bar, heading to the register when something caught her eye. A white police officer was standing at the back of the store, observing her. His arms were crossed, his posture stiff, and his icy blue eyes seemed to be glued to her every move. Angela frowned slightly. It was rare to see other officers in this part of town, especially one she didn't recognize. She tried to brush it off, telling herself not to overthink it. After all, she was a captain, not just any officer. Still, the man's presence unnerved her. After paying for her items, she headed toward the exit. Just as she pushed the door open, the voice behind her froze her in her tracks. "Excuse me, ma'am. I need to see some identification." Angela turned slowly, her expression neutral but her heart racing. The officer stepped forward, his hand resting casually on the holster of his gun. His voice carried a mix of arrogance and suspicion that immediately put Angela on edge. He was younger than her, probably in his early 30s, with a chiseled jaw and short-cropped blonde hair. The name on his badge read Officer Rick Stevens. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand why you're asking for my ID," Angela said calmly, though her patience was already wearing thin. "I saw you acting suspiciously in the store," Officer Stevens replied, his tone cold and condescending. "I'm going to need to see some identification now." Angela couldn't believe what she was hearing. She had done nothing out of the ordinary, nothing that warranted this kind of treatment. Her anger simmered beneath the surface, but she kept her composure. "Acting suspiciously?" she repeated, her voice steady. "I'm a police captain. I don't need to show you my ID unless you have a legitimate reason to ask for it." Stephen's eyes narrowed. He clearly didn't like being challenged. "And I saw you handling merchandise and acting like you were going to steal something. I'm asking you one last time, let me see your ID." Angela felt her blood boil. Steal something? She had only picked up a granola bar and a bottle of water. Was this officer really accusing her of shoplifting? The insult was unbearable, but the reality was even more crushing. She knew exactly why he was targeting her. It wasn't about her actions, it was about her skin color. Taking a deep breath, Angela stepped forward, her eyes locked on Stevens. "Officer Stevens, I'm Captain Angela Pierce with the Central City Police Department. You're going to need to come up with a much better reason to detain me. I've been in this store dozens of times, and I can assure you I've never stolen a thing in my life." Stevens' face hardened. His hand tightened on the grip of his gun, and for a split second, Angela wondered if this situation could escalate even further. But she wasn't backing down. Not this time. "Captain?" "Huh?" Stevens sneered. "We'll see about that. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Angela's heart dropped. She blinked in shock, not believing what she had just heard. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Stevens said, stepping closer, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're under arrest for suspicion of theft." The small store seemed to close in on her. Her mind raced, calculating her next move. As a police officer, she had been trained for hostile encounters, but she had never expected to be on the receiving end of such blatant racism and abuse of power. Angela knew her rights, but she also knew how easily things could go wrong if she made one wrong move. "I suggest you reconsider what you're doing," Angela said firmly, but the tremor in her voice betrayed the depth of her disbelief. "You're making a huge mistake." Stevens ignored her warning. He pulled out a pair of handcuffs, the metallic clinking sound echoing in the small store. Mr. Patel, the cashier, watched in horror, clearly too afraid to intervene. The few other customers in the store had frozen in place, their eyes wide with shock as they witnessed the surreal scene unfolding before them. "Turn around," Stevens barked, his patience clearly running thin. Angela's hands clenched into fists at her sides. This was an unimaginable violation, and yet here she was, being humiliated in public by someone who should have been her colleague, her equal, if not her subordinate. She could see the triumph in Stevens' eyes, the twisted satisfaction of exerting his authority over her. Reluctantly, she turned around, her back to Stevens, and slowly placed her hands behind her back. The handcuffs snapped around her wrists with a chilling finality. The situation had taken a devastating turn, but Angela knew this was far from over. Angela's breath came in shallow bursts as Officer Stevens shoved her roughly toward the door of the store. Her wrists ached from the tight grip of the handcuffs, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the humiliation burning deep inside her. As she stepped out onto the sidewalk, the eyes of passers-by followed her, their expressions a mixture of confusion and disbelief. It wasn't every day they saw a high-ranking police officer handcuffed, being marched down the street like a common criminal. The heat of the sun bore down on her, adding to the suffocating weight of the situation. Angela could feel her chest tightening, but she forced herself to stay calm. She couldn't let Stevens see how rattled she was. He was enjoying this far too much already. His grip on her arm was firm and forceful, and she could sense his arrogance in every movement. "Officer Stevens," she said, her voice low but steady, "you're making a serious mistake. I'll give you one last chance to walk away from this before it blows up in your face." Stevens smirked, glancing down at her with cold indifference. "Is that a threat, Captain?" He spat the title out as though it were poison, because it sure sounds like one. "You think just because you're some big shot captain, you're above the law?" Angela gritted her teeth. It was taking every ounce of self-control not to lash out at him. She knew how quickly things could escalate, and she refused to let him manipulate her into reacting. "This isn't about being above the law. This is about you abusing your power," she replied, her tone sharp but measured. Stevens said nothing in response, but the smirk never left his face. He clearly wasn't interested in reason. As they approached his squad car, parked along the curb, Angela spotted a few pedestrians pulling out their phones, recording the scene. She wanted to scream, to tell them this was all a mistake, but she kept her head held high, refusing to let this break her. Stevens roughly opened the back door of the squad car and shoved her inside without a word. The door slammed shut behind her, and she was left staring out through the wire mesh divider at the front seat. The inside of the car was stifling, the air thick and hot, making it difficult to breathe. Sweat began to bead on her forehead, but she refused to show any sign of discomfort. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Angela watched as Stevens leaned against the car, pulling out his radio. His voice crackled over the police dispatch system as he called in her arrest. "This is Officer Stevens, badge number 4396. I've apprehended a suspect, female, black, mid-30s, Captain Angela Pierce of the Central City PD, charged, suspected theft. Angela's stomach churned at the sound of him casually calling her a suspect, reducing her entire career, her reputation, to nothing more than a few words on a radio call. The absurdity of it all gnawed at her, but there was something else, a deeper dread creeping into the pit of her stomach. She knew this situation wasn't just about a false accusation. There was a venomous undercurrent of something darker at play. After he finished his call, Stephen strolled around to the front of the car and climbed into the driver's seat. He didn't say a word as he pulled out of the parking lot, the squad car lurching forward with a jolt. Angela shifted uncomfortably in the back, her hands still cuffed behind her, her mind racing as she tried to calculate her next move. She had to get ahead of this before it spiraled completely out of control. The drive to the precinct was agonizingly slow. Angela watched the familiar streets pass by, each one filled with memories of her years patrolling and protecting this very community. It felt surreal being on the other side of the law now. And for what? A baseless, racist accusation by an officer who seemed to take joy in her downfall. When they finally pulled into the precinct parking lot, Angela's pulse quickened. She'd spent countless hours here overseeing officers, leading investigations, and maintaining order. But today, she was being dragged in as a criminal. The irony wasn't lost on her. Stevens yanked open the back door, pulling Angela out with a force that almost caused her to lose her balance. She steadied herself, glaring at him, but said nothing. The time for words was over. She needed action, and fast. As they entered the precinct, heads turned. Officers, detectives, and staff paused in their tracks, their eyes wide as they took in the sight of Angela Pierce, their captain, being escorted in handcuffs by one of their own. The tension in the room was thick, almost palpable. Angela could feel the weight of every gaze on her, some filled with confusion, others with shock, and a few with what seemed like disbelief. Captain Pierce? One officer muttered, as if trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Stevens ignored them all, pushing her through the lobby and down the hallway toward the booking area. Angela's heart hammered in her chest. She could feel the walls closing in on her, but she wouldn't let this break her spirit. Not here. Not in front of everyone she had worked with for so long. As they reached the booking desk, Stevens slammed a stack of papers down in front of the officer on duty, a gruff-looking man named Officer Reynolds. "Got a suspect for processing," Stevens said casually. "Suspected theft." Reynolds glanced up, his eyes widening as he saw who was standing in front of him. "Captain Pierce? What's going on here?" he asked, his tone a mix of concern and disbelief. Angela opened her mouth to respond, but Stevens cut her off. Caught her red-handed. She was about to walk out of Patel's store with stolen merchandise, he said, the lie rolling off his tongue as if it were the truth. The room seemed to freeze in time. Reynolds stared at Stevens, then back at Angela, clearly struggling to process the situation. "Is this true, Captain?" Reynolds asked softly, his brows furrowed in confusion. Angela shook her head, her voice firm. "It's a lie. I didn't steal anything. This is a gross abuse of power." Stevens leaned in, his face inches from hers. "You can deny it all you want, but you're going down for this." Angela's heart pounded in her chest as she faced Officer Reynolds at the booking desk, trying to steady her breath. She wasn't sure what shocked her more, the audacity of Stevens to lie so boldly, or the fact that her entire world was crumbling before her eyes in front of the people she had worked with for years. Reynolds, clearly torn, stared down at the paperwork that Stevens had slapped on the counter. "Reynolds," Angela said, her voice low but steady. "You've known me for years. You know I would never do something like this." Reynolds met her eyes, hesitation flickering in his expression. "I don't know what's going on, Captain, but this looks bad. he sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Let's just get you processed, and we can figure this out afterward. Angela bit her lip, pushing back the frustration bubbling up inside her. She could tell that Reynolds wasn't entirely convinced by Stevens, but he was caught in a system that forced him to go along with the process. Her badge, her rank, none of it mattered at this moment. The machine was set in motion, and she was trapped in its gears. Reynolds slowly pulled out the fingerprinting kit, his eyes still showing traces of doubt, but his hands moved with routine precision. Angela's fingers were pressed against the cold ink pad, one by one, leaving her prints on the stark white sheet. The humiliation of the process weighed on her like a crushing force. She had booked suspects at this very desk countless times, but now she was the one on the other side. Stevens stood a few feet away, arms crossed, a smug grin tugging at the corner of his lips. His eyes gleamed with satisfaction, as if every step of this ordeal was fueling his twisted sense of power. Angela shot him a glare, silently promising that she would not let him get away with this. After the fingerprinting, Reynolds motioned toward the camera set up by the wall. "I'm sorry, Captain, but we need a mugshot." Angela swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay composed. She stood in front of the camera, the bright flash illuminating her face. For a brief moment, it felt like a permanent scar was being etched into her record, a mark of shame that would follow her forever, whether or not she proved her innocence. As soon as the flash faded, Angela turned to face Stevens, her eyes narrowing. "Why are you doing this?" she demanded, her voice calm but laced with steel. "What's your game here? Do you think no one's going to figure out that this is all a setup?" Stevens tilted his head, pretending to be amused by her question. "Game? There's no game here, Captain. I'm just enforcing the law, something you clearly have forgotten how to do." He shrugged nonchalantly, as if the gravity of the situation meant nothing to him. Angela could feel the rage building inside her, but she fought to keep it in check. She had seen too many people make reckless decisions in moments of anger, and she wasn't about to become one of them. She needed to stay calm, stay smart. She had to play the long game, even if every fiber of her being wanted to lash out at Stevens. Before she could respond, Reynolds spoke up again, his voice hesitant. "Captain, we're going to have to hold you in one of the cells until this is sorted out. I really wish there was something else I could do, but rules are rules." Angela nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "I understand. Reynolds, just do what you have to do," she said, her voice quieter than before. Reynolds led her down the hallway toward the holding cells. The echo of their footsteps on the concrete floors sent a chill down her spine. She had been through these halls 100 times, but now they felt cold, unfamiliar. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in on her, suffocating her with every step. The cell doors loomed ahead, steel bars glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights. Reynolds unlocked one of the cells, gesturing for Angela to step inside. She hesitated for a second, taking in the cold, barren room. A small bench, a toilet, and the unforgiving bars were all that greeted her. The reality of her situation hit her like a sledgehammer. She was being thrown into a cell, not as a protector of the law, but as a suspect. Stepping inside, Angela turned back to face Reynolds as he shut the door behind her. The clink of the lock echoed in her ears, a sound she would never forget. "I'll get in touch with someone higher up," Reynolds said, his voice quiet, almost apologetic. "We'll get to the bottom of this." Angela nodded, but the weight of the situation felt crushing. She sat down on the hard bench, her mind racing with questions and strategies. How had things gotten to this point so quickly, and why was Stevens so determined to ruin her? As she sat in the silence of the cell, Angela's thoughts drifted back to the moments before the arrest. Something about the way Stevens had shown up at the store had felt off, too orchestrated. It was almost as if he had been waiting for her, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The pieces of the puzzle were there, but she couldn't quite fit them together yet. She knew one thing for sure: this wasn't just about a stolen bracelet. There was something deeper at play, something far more sinister. The hours crawled by as Angela sat alone. The silence was only broken by the occasional clatter of keys or murmured voices from the station. Every second felt like an eternity. She wondered if anyone in the department would speak up for her, or if Stevens had already poisoned their minds with his lies. Just as her thoughts began to spiral, the sound of approaching footsteps broke through the quiet. Angela sat up, her body tense. She heard the familiar voice of Lieutenant Hayes, a senior officer and someone she had worked closely with for years. "Where is she?" Hayes' voice was sharp, cutting through the hallway. "Back here, Lieutenant," Reynolds replied. Angela's heart raced as the two officers approached her cell. When Hayes came into view, her expression was unreadable. Her sharp blue eyes scanned the room, settling on Angela with a mix of concern and something else, a quiet determination. Hayes stopped in front of the bars, hands on her hips. "What the hell is going on here, Pierce?" she asked, her tone hard to read. Angela stood, meeting her gaze. "It's a setup. Lieutenant, Stevens arrested me on false charges." Hayes didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned to Reynolds, who stood awkwardly by the door. "Get her out of here," Hayes said quietly, her voice tight. Reynolds hesitated, glancing at the paperwork in his hands. "Lieutenant, I said get her out," Hayes repeated more firmly this time. Angela stood, her pulse quickening as the sharp command cut through the tension. Reynolds fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking slightly as he unlocked the cell door. The metallic clank of the bars being pulled open felt like a small relief, but Angela knew the situation was far from over. She stepped out of the cell cautiously, her eyes never leaving Hayes, who stood with an air of authority, her face unreadable. Hayes had always been strict but fair, a no-nonsense type of officer who expected results. Angela wasn't sure if her presence was a sign of salvation or something else entirely. "Come with me," Hayes said, her voice steady as she turned on her heel, walking down the corridor. Angela followed, with Reynolds trailing awkwardly behind. As they moved through the station, the officers they passed shot confused glances in Angela's direction. She could feel the weight of their judgment, the whispers that followed her every step. It was as though the department, the place where she had dedicated years of her life, was closing in on her. They reached the end of the hall, stopping at a small, dimly lit office. Hayes pushed the door open and motioned for Angela to step inside. She entered the room, the walls lined with old case files and stacks of paperwork, a testament to the endless grind of police work. Hayes closed the door behind them, leaving Reynolds outside. "Sit down," Hayes said, her tone hard but not unkind. Angela sank into the chair across from her, still trying to piece together what had just happened. She opened her mouth to speak, but Hayes held up a hand, cutting her off. "Before you say anything, I need to know one thing," Hayes said, leaning forward slightly, her blue eyes piercing. "Did you steal the bracelet?" The question hit Angela like a slap in the face. She had expected more than this, more understanding, more trust, but the doubt in Hayes' voice cut deep. "No," Angela said firmly, her eyes locked with Hayes. "I didn't steal anything. Stevens set me up." Hayes studied her face for a long moment, her eyes narrowing as if she were trying to detect any hint of deception. The silence in the room was suffocating, the air thick with tension. Finally, Hayes sat back in her chair, exhaling a long breath. "I believe you," she said, her voice quiet but certain. Angela blinked, momentarily stunned. "You do?" Hayes nodded. "I've worked with you for years, Pierce. I know you. You've never given me a reason to doubt your integrity. But Stevens, he's always been a loose cannon, This isn't the first time I've heard complaints about his behavior, especially toward officers of color. Angela's jaw clenched at the mention of Stevens' reputation. She had always known that Stevens had issues with authority, especially when that authority came from someone who didn't fit his narrow worldview. But hearing Hayes confirm it made her blood boil. "So, what happens now?" Angela asked, her voice low, but her mind racing with a million questions. She had spent the past few hours as a suspect, humiliated and treated like a criminal. She wanted answers, and she wanted justice. Hayes leaned forward, her fingers interlaced on the desk. "Now we handle this carefully. If Stevens is setting you up, we need proof, something solid that will hold up in an investigation." Angela frowned. "Proof? How am I supposed to get proof when I'm the one being framed?" "We dig," Hayes said simply. "There's always a trail. No one pulls something like this without leaving breadcrumbs behind." Just as Hayes finished speaking, the door swung open. Stevens barged in, his smug grin replaced by a look of indignant anger. "What's going on in here?" he demanded, his eyes flicking between Angela and Hayes. Hayes stood up slowly, her posture calm but commanding. "Officer Stevens, I'm speaking with Captain Pierce. Do you have something urgent?" Stevens scowled. "I have the paperwork to formally charge her. This little chat doesn't change the fact that she's a suspect in a theft." Angela clenched her fists under the table, fighting the urge to lash out. The arrogance in Stevens' voice made her stomach turn. He was so certain of his lies, so confident that he could get away with it. Hayes didn't flinch. "We'll see about those charges, Stevens. Right now, I'm handling this." Stevens took a step closer, his face inches from Hayes. "Handling this? You should be supporting your officers, not coddling criminals." Hayes remained stone-faced. "That's enough. If you have a problem with the way I'm handling this, take it up with the chief. Until then, stay out of my way." Stevens glared at her, his face reddening with anger. For a moment, it looked like he might argue, but then he turned on his heel and stormed out of the office, slamming the door behind him. The room was silent again, the tension hanging thick in the air. Angela finally let out the breath she had been holding, her pulse still racing. "He's going to come after you, you know," Angela said quietly, her voice laced with worry. "He won't let this go." "He won't," Hayes said, sitting back down, her expression unreadable. "Let him try. I'm not afraid of Stevens, and neither should you be." Angela nodded, though the knot in her stomach remained. Hayes might not be afraid of Stevens, but Angela knew better than to underestimate him. He had already crossed the line, framing her for something she didn't do. Who knew what he was capable of if he felt threatened? As the silence stretched between them, Hayes leaned forward, her voice lowering. "Listen, Pierce, you've got to be smart about this. If you try to confront Stevens head-on, he'll twist it against you. We need to play this carefully." Angela frowned. "Carefully? You want me to just sit back and let him tear my reputation apart?" "No," Hayes said firmly, "but if you go after him now, without a plan, it'll only make things worse. I will dig into his records, his past complaints, anything we can find that will expose him for what he is." Angel's mind raced with the possibilities. There had to be something, some piece of evidence, some witness that could prove her innocence and take Stevens down. But finding it would be a challenge, especially with him watching her every move. What about the security footage from the store? Angela asked suddenly, her mind latching onto the thought. There were cameras everywhere. Maybe they caught something that could clear me. Hayes raised an eyebrow, nodding slowly. "That's a good start. I'll put in a request for the footage. If there's anything on those tapes that proves Stevens was lying, we'll find it." Angela felt a spark of hope for the first time since this nightmare had begun. It wasn't much, but it was something. She just had to hold on long enough for the truth to come to light. The room fell silent once more, the gravity of the situation hanging over them like a dark cloud. Angela's heart raced, a mix of fear, anger, and determination coursing through her veins. She wasn't going to let Stevens win. Not like this. Angela could feel her pulse pounding as Hayes left the office, leaving her alone to gather her thoughts. It was clear that this wasn't just about the bracelet anymore. Stevens was out to ruin her, and he wouldn't stop until he had succeeded. But she wasn't about to let him destroy everything she had worked for, not without a fight. The station seemed unusually quiet as she made her way back to her desk, her mind racing through the possibilities. If Stevens was framing her, it meant he had planned this out carefully. He had access to the evidence, the reports, and the paperwork that could manipulate the narrative against her. She couldn't afford to take any chances. Angela's phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking her out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. It was Marcus, her partner from the field. His timing couldn't have been better. "Angela, where are you? I've been looking for you all day," Marcus said, his voice tense. "I'm still at the station," Angela replied, lowering her voice as she looked around cautiously. "It's Stevens. He's trying to pin a theft on me, and things are getting bad. I need your help." There was a pause on the other end before Marcus spoke again. "I figured something was off when I saw Stevens walking around like he owned the place. What do you need? Can you dig into the case file on that bracelet? I need to know everything. Who reported it? Who logged the evidence? Anything that might give us a lead. And we need to get our hands on that store security footage. There has to be something on there that clears my name." "I'm on it," Marcus replied without hesitation. "I'll meet you at your place tonight. We'll go through everything." Angela felt a small surge of relief. Marcus had always been the one person she could trust completely on the force. If anyone could help her unravel Stevens' twisted plot, it was him. As she ended the call, Angela turned to head out, only to stop dead in her tracks. Stevens was standing by the entrance, talking to a group of officers. He locked eyes with her, his lips curling into a smug smile that made her skin crawl. Angela squared her shoulders, refusing to let him see her sweat. She walked past him, her heart pounding in her chest, but her expression remained cold and unreadable. She couldn't give him the satisfaction of knowing how much his little power play had rattled her. She stepped outside into the brisk night air, breathing deeply to calm her racing mind. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. Later that night, Angela sat at her kitchen table, staring at the scattered papers in front of her. Marcus had managed to get a copy of the incident report, but so far there was nothing that stood out. The security footage request was still pending, and Angela's patience was wearing thin. "This doesn't add up," Marcus said, leaning back in his chair as he studied the file. "The whole thing stinks. Whoever made this report knew exactly how to cover their tracks." Angela nodded, frustration gnawing at her. Stevens has been doing this for years. He knows how to manipulate the system. But there has to be something he missed. We just haven't found it yet. Marcus drummed his fingers on the table, deep in thought. "What about the store owner? Have you talked to them?" "Not yet," Angela replied, her mind flashing back to the moment in the store when she was accused. The clerk had looked terrified, but something about his reaction had felt off, like he had been coached on what to say. "But I'm planning to. I think he knows more than he let on." Marcus nodded, a determined look in his eyes. "Then we pay him a visit tomorrow. If he's in on this, we'll get him to talk." The next morning, Angela and Marcus pulled up to the small jewelry store where the alleged theft had taken place. The streets were quiet, with only a few pedestrians wandering by. Angela's stomach tightened as she stepped out of the car, her mind flashing back to the humiliating moments of her arrest. The bell above the door chimed as they entered the store, and the clerk, a nervous-looking man in his 50s, looked up from behind the counter. His face went pale when he saw Angela. "Can I help you?" he stammered, glancing nervously between her and Marcus. "We need to talk," Angela said, her voice steady. "About what happened the other day." The clerk swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the store as if looking for an escape. "I already told the police everything I know. I don't want any trouble." Angela stepped closer, her gaze locking onto his. "You're already in trouble. If you're involved in this setup, now's your chance to come clean before things get worse." Marcus crossed his arms, his presence adding weight to Angela's words. The clerk's hand shook as he wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. "I didn't have a choice," the clerk finally admitted, his voice trembling. "Stevens came in here last week, told me I had to report the bracelet missing, said it would be taken care of. I didn't ask questions. I just let you lie because Stevens told you to." Angela finished her sentence, her anger simmering just below the surface. "Do you have any idea what he's trying to do to me?" The clerk looked down, guilt washing over his features. "I didn't know it was going to turn into this. I'm sorry, but I can't take it back now. It's already in the system." Angela's fists clenched at her sides. She wanted to scream, to throw the man's cowardice back in his face, but she forced herself to stay calm. This wasn't about him. It was about Stevens. And now she had proof that Stevens had orchestrated the entire thing. "We'll need you to make an official statement," Marcus said, his tone hard. "If you cooperate, maybe we can cut you a deal. But you're going to have to come down to the station with us." The clerk looked like he was going to be sick, but he nodded, his eyes full of regret. Angela turned to leave, her mind already racing with the next steps. They had a witness now, someone who could expose Stevens for the manipulative, racist officer he was. But she knew it wouldn't be that simple. Stevens still had the upper hand, and she had no doubt he would fight tooth and nail to keep his secret buried. As they left the store, Angela's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a message from Hayes. "I've got the security footage. Meet me at the station." Angela's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the evidence that could finally clear her name. But as she and Marcus drove back to the station, an uneasy feeling settled in her chest. Stevens wasn't the type to back down easily. If he knew they were onto him, he'd strike back, and Angela wasn't sure how far he'd be willing to go to protect himself. Angela's mind was racing as she and Marcus pulled up to the station. The gravity of the situation weighed heavily on her shoulders. She had a witness, someone who could expose Stevens for the manipulative officer he was. But she knew this was just the beginning. Stevens wasn't going to go down without a fight. He had too much power, too many connections within the department. And now they had the security footage, which could be the key to finally clearing her name, if they could get it before Stevens did something drastic. As soon as they stepped out of the car, the tension around the station was palpable. Officers milled about, but something felt off. The usual buzz of the place was muted, as if everyone knew something big was about to happen but didn't want to say it out loud. "Let's make this quick," Marcus muttered under his breath. "The last thing we need is for Stevens to get wind of what we're doing." Angela nodded, her heart pounding as they headed inside. She kept her head down, avoiding eye contact with the officers they passed, her senses heightened with every step. She knew they were being watched, but she couldn't worry about that now. All that mattered was getting to Hayes and reviewing the footage. They found him waiting in the evidence room, a small dark space in the back of the station that was rarely used. His face was grim as he greeted them, his eyes darting nervously around the room as if expecting Stevens to burst in at any moment. "I pulled the footage," Hayes said quietly, handing Angela a flash drive. "But there's something you need to know. It's not what we expected." Angela's stomach dropped. What do you mean? Hayes ran a hand through his hair, clearly struggling to find the right words. It's edited. The footage is incomplete. It shows you in the store, but the key moments are missing, like the part where you supposedly stole the bracelet. Angela cursed under her breath. Stevens had gotten to the footage before they had. Of course he had. He was always one step ahead, always manipulating the situation in his favor. But that didn't mean all hope was lost. They still had the witness, and if they could just get the unedited footage, they might still stand a chance. We need to find the original tape, Marcus said, his voice low and urgent. There's no way Stevens could have gotten rid of it that fast. It has to be somewhere. Hayes nodded. I've been thinking the same thing. I'm going to keep digging, but you two need to be careful. Stevens knows you're onto him. He's going to come after you. Angela's mind was racing. Stevens had the power to destroy her, but he couldn't erase the truth. If they could just find that tape and expose him, his career would be over. But that wasn't going to happen without a fight. Let's split up, Marcus suggested. We'll cover more ground that way. You take the witness to a safe location, and I'll keep working on getting the footage. If anything goes south, we meet back here. Angela agreed, though a knot of anxiety twisted in her gut. She hated splitting up, but Marcus was right. They couldn't waste time. Every second they delayed was a second Stevens could use to cover his tracks. Later that night, Angela was driving through the city with the witness, the clerk from the jewelry store, in the passenger seat beside her. The man was shaking, his fear palpable. She couldn't blame him. He had gotten tangled in something much bigger than he had ever imagined, and now his life was at risk just as much as hers was. We're almost there, Angela said, trying to keep her voice calm. I've got a safe house set up for you. You'll be protected until we can figure out our next move. The man nodded, but his eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, as if expecting someone to be following them. Angela's nerves were on edge as well. She had the sinking feeling that Stevens was already watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. She checked the mirrors constantly, half expecting a black SUV to appear behind them. Her phone buzzed on the dashboard. It was Marcus. She quickly picked it up, putting it on speaker. I've got a lead, Marcus said, his voice tense. I think I know where Stevens is keeping the original footage. It's locked up at his house. He must have taken it there before editing it. We need to move now if we're going to get it before he destroys it. Angela's heart raced. This was it, the moment they had been waiting for. But breaking into Steve's house? That was risky, especially since he was a cop. If they were caught, it could mean the end of their careers and possibly their lives. We don't have a choice, Angela said, more to herself than to Marcus. I'll meet you there. She turned the car around and headed toward the outskirts of the city where Steve lived. The witness, wide-eyed, looked at her with panic. Are you sure about this? He asked, his voice trembling. No, Angela admitted, but it's our only option. When they arrived at Steve's house, the tension was unbearable. The street was eerily quiet, with only the distant hum of cars passing by in the night. Angela parked a few blocks away, not wanting to alert anyone to their presence. Marcus was already waiting for them, crouched behind a bush, his face set with determination. We're going in through the back, Marcus whispered. There's no security camera back there, but we'll need to move fast. Steve could be home at any moment. Angela nodded, her heart pounding as they moved stealthily through the darkness. The house loomed in front of them, a two-story structure with tall windows that looked like empty, watchful eyes. They reached the back door. They and Marcus quickly went to work on the lock. Within moments, they were inside, creeping through the dimly lit house. Angela's nerves were on fire as they moved through the hallways, each creak of the floorboards making her jump. Finally, they reached Steve's office. Marcus gestured for Angela to keep watch while he rifled through the desk, searching for the tape. "Got it," Marcus whispered, holding up a small, unmarked flash drive. "This has to be it." But just as they were about to leave, a loud crash echoed through the house, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Steve was home. "Go," Angela hissed, pushing Marcus toward the door. They raced through the house, their hearts pounding as they heard Steve shouting from behind them. Angela reached for her gun, ready for a fight, but they didn't have time to turn back. They burst through the back door and into the night, running as fast as they could toward the car. Shots rang out behind them, the sound of gunfire tearing through the air. Angela's pulse raced as she ducked behind the car, pulling the witness down with her. "We need to get out of here now," Marcus shouted, firing back at Steve as he closed in. Angela jumped into the driver's seat, her hands shaking as she started the engine. Marcus dove into the passenger seat just as Steve's bullets shattered the rear window. They sped off into the night, adrenaline pumping through their veins. Angela slammed on the brakes, heart pounding, as they swerved around a corner. The gunfire had stopped for now, but she knew Steve wouldn't let them off that easily. They had the flash drive, but now they were on the run, and every second counted. "We need to get to a safe place," Marcus said, his voice shaky but firm. "Somewhere we can regroup and figure out our next move." Angela nodded, her mind racing. They had to get the flash drive to someone they could trust, someone who could help them expose Steve and clear her name. But who? The police department had become a den of corruption, and she couldn't trust anyone within its ranks. "Let's head to my aunt's place," she said suddenly. "She's out of town, and it's off the grid. We can lay low there until we figure things out." Marcus agreed, and they sped through the city, taking side streets to avoid any possible pursuit. Angela's heart raced as she glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the flashing lights of a police cruiser behind them. After what felt like an eternity, they arrived at her aunt's secluded house. Angela parked in the back, hidden from the main road. They rushed inside, locking the door behind them. The silence was deafening, and Angela took a moment to catch her breath. "Okay, let's see what's on this drive," Marcus said, pulling out the flash drive. They set up her laptop on the kitchen table and connected it, the screen illuminating the dark room as the files loaded. Angela's mind spun. She couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. If they couldn't expose Steve, she would be branded a criminal. Finally, the screen flickered to life. It showed a series of clips from the jewelry store, but the edits were glaring. Steve had cut out crucial moments that could have exonerated her. "Look at this," Marcus exclaimed, pointing at a timestamp on the footage. "This shows when you were in the store, but what happened right before? It's all gone." Angela gritted her teeth. "He's trying to bury the truth. We need to get the originals from the store and confront him with the evidence." Just as they were plotting their next move, Angela's phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from an unknown number. "We know where you are. You can't hide." A chill ran down her spine. They had to move, and fast. "Marcus, we need to get out of here. Steve's on our tail," Angela said urgently, her heart racing again. "Right behind you," he replied, grabbing his gun and tucking it into his waistband. They slipped out the back door and crouched behind the bushes, scanning the area. Suddenly, headlights appeared in the distance, illuminating the dark woods surrounding the house. "It's him," Angela whispered, adrenaline surging through her veins. "We need to act fast." They hurried around the side of the house, keeping low as they moved toward the front. Angela could hear the crunch of tires on gravel as Steve parked his car. "Get ready," she breathed, gripping her weapon tightly. The sound of a door slamming echoed in the night, and then they heard Steve's voice barking orders over his radio. This is Officer Steve. I'm in pursuit of two suspects. They may be armed and dangerous. Angela exchanged glances with Marcus. Knowing this was their moment, they had to confront him before he could rally back up. On three, she said. 1, 2, 3. They burst out from behind the bushes, guns drawn. Steve, drop your weapon! Steve turned, surprise flashing across his face before morphing into anger. You think you can point a gun at me? You're in deep trouble, Angela said. Not as deep as you think, she shouted back, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. We know what you did. He sneered, raising his gun, but Marcus fired first. The bullet grazed Stephen's shoulder, and he stumbled back, cursing under his breath. Get inside, Marcus yelled. They dashed for the open door, adrenaline pumping through their veins. They needed to get to the laptop and upload the footage before Stevens could retaliate. Inside, Angela quickly booted up the laptop while Marcus kept watch at the door. The sound of sirens echoed in the distance, growing closer. Time was running out. Come on, Angela urged, her fingers flying over the keyboard. She opened the file with the unedited footage, breathless as she clicked to upload it to the cloud. Angela, hurry, Marcus called, his eyes darting toward the window. Just then, Stevens kicked the door open, anger radiating from him like a storm. You think you can run from me? He roared, raising his gun again. Marcus, get down! Angela yelled, diving to the side as bullets whizzed past them, shattering the kitchen window. Marcus returned fire, hitting Stevens in the leg. He let out a howl of pain. You'll regret this. Stevens spat, staggering back but still trying to keep his gun steady. Upload it, Marcus shouted, moving to shield Angela. We can't let him take you down for something you didn't do. With a final click, Angela felt a rush of relief as the footage finished uploading. It's done, she yelled. Let's go! Marcus shouted, pulling Angela up and toward the back door. They sprinted into the woods behind her aunt's house, not looking back as the sirens closed in. The night air was thick with tension as they ran, their hearts pounding in sync. They needed to get far enough away to regroup and make a plan. But with Stevens wounded and determined, the chase was far from over. As they dashed through the trees, Angela's mind raced. They had the evidence, but the fight was far from finished. She glanced at Marcus, who was keeping pace beside her. They had come too far to let this go now. They would expose Stevens and reclaim her name. The sound of footsteps behind them grew louder, and Angela knew they couldn't stop. The shocking outcome of this night would leave everyone speechless, and they were going to make sure of it. As they burst through the tree line, Angela spotted a small cabin in the distance. Over there, she shouted, pointing. It was a long shot, but it could provide temporary shelter. Let's go, Marcus urged, leading the way. They reached the cabin just as they heard the sound of an engine revving in the distance. Stevens wasn't far behind. They slipped inside, locking the door behind them and peering through the grimy windows. Breathing heavily, they waited in silence, listening for any sign of Stevens. The tension in the air was suffocating. Suddenly, they heard a loud crash outside. Angela's heart dropped as she turned to see Stevens burst through the front door. Gun raised. You think you can hide from me? He roared, his eyes wild with rage. Marcus fired again, the bullet hitting Stevens in the shoulder, but he kept coming. You're done, Angela. You're a criminal, and I'll make sure you pay. Angela and Marcus held their breath as Stevens staggered back from the gunshot, clutching his shoulder. The room was thick with tension, and the weight of their situation hung heavily in the air. We have the evidence, Angela whispered. But now it's about survival. Get ready, Marcus said, urgency in his voice. We can't let him take you in. Fueled by rage, Stevens pushed through the pain, his eyes burning with fury. You think you can just waltz in here and turn the tables? You're a thief, Angela, and I'll make sure everyone knows it. In a flash, he raised his gun again, but Marcus was quicker. He fired another shot, this time hitting Stevens squarely in the leg. The corrupt officer fell to the floor with a crash, his weapon clattering away. "Now!" Marcus shouted, grabbing Angela's arm. "Let's get out of here!" They bolted through the back door just as sirens approached in the distance. The cacophony of lights and sounds filled the air, but they couldn't stop. They raced away from the cabin, hearts pounding and adrenaline surging through their veins. As they dashed through the woods, Angela felt a surge of hope. They had the footage. They had a chance to expose Stevens and clear her name. The world would see the truth, and she would no longer be the villain in his story. After what felt like an eternity of running, they finally reached a clearing. They stumbled onto a dirt road, and in the distance, they saw the flashing lights of police cars approaching the cabin. But this time, they weren't running from the law. "Over here!" Marcus shouted, waving his arms as they spotted a patrol car. The officer inside looked surprised, but quickly pulled over, eyes wide with concern. "Hey, we need help!" Angela yelled, breathless. "There's a corrupt officer, Stevens. He's been framing me." The officer stepped out, hand hovering near his gun. "Slow down. What's happening?" "Listen," Marcus interjected, urgency in his voice. "We have evidence on this flash drive that proves she's innocent and exposes Stevens' corruption. He's in that cabin right now." Before the officer could respond, a commotion erupted from the direction of the cabin. Stevens was back on his feet, furious and desperate. "They're lying. You can't trust them," he bellowed, charging toward the road. "Step back," the officer commanded, raising his gun at Stevens. "Get on the ground." Angela's heart raced as she watched the scene unfold. The tension was palpable, and she knew they had to act fast. "The footage!" she shouted. "We need to show you the footage." The officer hesitated, but then shifted his gaze to Stevens, who was now raging, refusing to back down. "Get on the ground now," he repeated, his voice firm. With a defiant look, Stevens raised his weapon again, aiming it at the officer. But this time, the officer was ready. He fired, hitting Stevens squarely in the chest. Angela gasped, fear washing over her as Stevens crumpled to the ground, his eyes wide with shock. The gun slipped from his hand, and the forest fell silent. "Call for backup," the officer shouted, kneeling beside Stevens. "Stay here with him. I'll handle this." Angela and Marcus exchanged looks of disbelief. Was it finally over? Minutes felt like hours as they waited for more officers to arrive. The sound of sirens filled the air, and soon several patrol cars swarmed the area, lights flashing and radios crackling. Angela felt a mix of relief and dread. Would they believe her? Would they see the truth? As the new officers approached, Angela stepped forward, her heart racing. "You have to listen. We have evidence against Officer Stevens. He was framing me for a crime I didn't commit." One of the officers, a woman with a calm demeanor, nodded. "Show us what you have." Angela handed over the flash drive, her hands trembling. "It's all on there. The real footage from the jewelry store. Everything." The officer nodded and turned to a colleague. "Get that uploaded and reviewed immediately." As they waited, Angela felt a sense of hope for the first time in days. The truth was about to come out, and Stevens would finally be held accountable for his actions. When the officer returned, her expression was serious. "The footage confirms your story. Stevens has been under investigation for months for misconduct. But this is the proof we needed." Tears of relief filled Angela's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, overwhelmed by the weight of everything that had happened. As the officers began to take statements and gather evidence, Marcus squeezed her hand. "You did it, Angela. You stood up to him." "I couldn't have done it without you," she replied, a smile breaking through her tears. In that moment, surrounded by law enforcement, Angela knew she was finally free from the shadow of Stevens' lies. She would clear her name and rebuild her life, no longer defined by the actions of a corrupt cop. As they prepared to leave the scene, Angela took one last look at the cabin. It would always be a reminder of the dark path she had walked, but now she could finally move forward with her head held high. She stepped into the light, ready to face whatever came next. The battle was hard fought, but the victory was hers, and it was only the beginning.